Okay, so it looks like we're live. So, Alex, please take it away.
Perfect. So thank you, Greg, and good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to everyone here on Zoom or on YouTube. And welcome to this final session, at least for this year, of the seminar series being Singular Historical and Theoretical Perspectives. I'm Alessandro De Cesaris, and I'm here with Gregory Scott Moss. We have organized this seminar cycle. And I must say, I believe, Greg, you agree with me, we are very happy at the end of this first year. There's been so many interesting discussions, so many things to comment and to discuss. And we have two announcements to make before introducing our guest for today. The first one is that there will be a second series next year. That means that we are going to have another cycle on Singularity in 2025. And the second news is that the outcome of these discussions will be a collected volume that we will be editing in English. So stay tuned. There will be more coming up next. This being said, we are at the end of this beautiful journey through the various meanings and debates on singularity, and I have the great honor and pleasure to introduce Gaetano Chiurazzi, who is professor for theoretical philosophy at the University of Turin, who's been with us throughout the seminar. So first of all, Gaetano, thank you so much for your participation. It's been great to have you with us with your insights. Gaetano Chiurazzi is an expert of metaphysics, in the history of metaphysics. He's written a beautiful book that's also translated in English. It's called Dunamis, Ontology of the Incommensurable. But his books are also translated in Portuguese, in French, in Spanish, and he has also written a very beautiful book on second nature from La School to digital technologies. He's an expert in hermeneutics, on the theory of judgment, on contemporary French philosophy, but he's also worked very strongly on Hegel's philosophy. And today he will give us a talk entitled Singularity, a Relation to Infinity. Just a closing remark. I believe that so there have been so many insights throughout this seminar, and I think Gaetano has heroically discussed with many monists. There was definitely many monists monistic standpoints expressed throughout the seminar. I believe Gaetano was in the minority, but we are leaving you the last word at very least. So this will be a great occasion to maybe wrap everything up and maybe to know how to start next year. Gaetano, thank you so much for being with us. You have the floor.
Okay, thank you, Alessandro, for the invitation, and thank you also, Gregory, for the invitation to these seminars. I have attended some of them, not all the seminars, unfortunately, and I find them very interesting. So I prepared also a presentation in PowerPoint, so I share the screen, just a moment. How can I make just?
It should be just above. You should have just the start presentation.
I believe we lost him. Oh, he's back. All right, let's try again.
Yeah.
Excuse me, I made something wrong. Are you there still?
Yes, yes, yes,
Okay,
no
Yes.
problem.
excuse me.
No problem.
So I have
Your time.
to share the screen in that way. Just a moment. Do you see?
Yes, we see. Perfect.
Okay. The title of my presentation is Singularity, a Relation to Infinity. And so, okay. So I would like with this presentation to propose an analysis of the concept of singularity and explore if and how it fits with the Hegelian concept of singularity. But rather than focusing on the parts of the science of logic, where Hegel explicitly discusses singularity, and particularly in subjective logic, I will consider those passages where concepts that provide, so to speak, the foundation for the concept of singularity are addressed. In particular, I will examine the concepts of infinity and contingency. These concepts indirectly reflect on what is meant by singularity in a logical or metaphysical sense. In this, I agree with Alessandro, who writes in his book Ai limiti del concetto, Genesi e forma della singolarità nella logica di Hegel, where he demonstrates exactly this connection, particularly the one between singularity and contingency. So I will start from a definition of singularity, and particularly from the definition of the Oxford Dictionary, which was mentioned also by Emmanuel Alloa in his seminar. So a first meaning of singularity in ordinary language, we can say, is the quality of something that makes it unusual or strange. Or more specific and technical meaning in mathematics and physics, a point at which a mathematical function or a physical quantity takes an infinite value, such as the center of a black hole, which is infinitely dense. So these definitions seem to refer to two different issues. One qualitative, that is strangeness, difference, or even a particularity in the sense of Besonderheit, and the other quantitative, that is the infinite value of a quantity. But in reality, they are, this is what I would like to suggest, closely connected. One might think that something is singular in the sense that it is atypical, exceptional, very different from what is usual, that is the meaning one. But in my opinion, meaning two highlights that in order for there to be real difference, something strange, it is necessary to introduce something like the infinite. In general, beyond the technical meaning, a singularity is a point where a radical transformation occurs compared to a previous state. For example, the point at which a precarious rock falls, or where a relatively minimal cause produces a very large effect. A very plastic description of the process we are dealing with when we speak of singularity in the sense specified above, that is a transformation where a quantitative increasing gives rise to a qualitative transformation, can be found in the preface to the Phenomenology of Spirit, where Hegel describes the growth of a child. I quote, "Spirit is indeed never at rest, but always engaged in moving forward. But just as the first breath drawn by a child after its long, quiet nourishment breaks the gradualness of merely quantitative growth, there is a qualitative leap, and the child is born. So likewise, the spirit in its formation matures slowly and quietly into its new shape, dissolving bit by bit the structure of its previous world, whose tottering state is only hinted at by isolated symptoms. The frivolity and boredom which unsettle the established order, the vague foreboding of something unknown, these are the heralds of approaching change. The gradual crumbling that left unaltered the face of the whole is cut short by a sunburst which in one flash illuminates the features of the new world. So this wonderful description nicely captures the connection between a merely quantitative description of movement or becoming in the form of a progressive growth or disintegration that continues infinitely, and the qualitative transformation that it produces, the leap that leads to the appearance of a new figure, of a new reality. It is the limit towards which the preceding figure was leading, and that is realized as the transformation of relations that is of form, which characterized the previous one, the limit of which was reached through what Hegel calls Aufhebung. Such a concept, as Antonio Moretto has observed, relying on some pages of Hegel's Geometrische Studien, can in fact be assimilated with the mathematical concept of passage to the limit, as happens when the sides of a polygon are multiplied so that it resolves at half in a circle, which is therefore the limit of the quantitative multiplication, but at the same time, a qualitatively different figure. So the singularity is, to repeat again the title of Alessandro's book, the limit of the concept, in the sense that it represents the point where something passes into something else, that limit where a real transformation is realized. As a first point, it is necessary to distinguish singularity from individuality, which does not appear at all in the aforementioned definitions of the Oxford Dictionary. The word individuum derives from Latin and means indivisible. It corresponds to the Greek atomos, which has the same meaning. The individual, therefore, represents the ultimate element of reality, beyond which one cannot go. Atoms, in fact, in the philosophies of Leucippus, Democritus, and Lucretius, are indivisible elements that constitute all things, which are thus made of these atoms through processes of composition and decomposition. But they retain the fundamental characteristics of Parmenides' being, namely, to be eternal, not subject to change, always identical to themselves. As is well known, ancient atomism is nothing but a form of Parmenidism of the multiple. Instead of there being a single principle, there are many atoms, but they all retain the characteristics of Parmenides' being. Phenomena are the result of processes of combination and recombination of these elements. But what is seen is not the true transformation of these elements, which remain always identical in themselves. It is thus clear how the concept of individual fits perfectly into a monist or pluralist context. The individual is a one, and as Hegel writes, the one is the principle of counting, die Zahl, das Eins zum Prinzip hat, writes Hegel, something ultimate and not further divisible. There can therefore be many ones, but their nature is entirely identical. In a monist context, such as, for instance, the one of Duns Scotus or Spinoza, the individual is therefore conceived as a final or first, depending on how one interprets the hierarchical scale, determination of being. In Spinoza, the individual is a mode of substance, that is, its final determination. As in the Porphyry's tree, to which reference has often been made in this seminar, the individual is what is found at the end of a process of internal determination within the one. Or conversely, it is that one from which the entire reality is constructed. This idea is typical of various philosophical conceptions up to the so-called logical atomism, according to which there exists a basic or protocol in the formulation of neo-positivism sentences or atomic facts that are irreducible to any more elementary ones. This is also the alternative laid out in Kant's second antinomy of the cosmological idea, according to which simple objects either exist, this is the thesis, or do not exist, antithesis. Wittgenstein, for instance, argues for the claim that there are simple objects in almost the same terms as Kant does in the thesis of the second antinomy. In the notebooks 1914-16, he writes, "It seems that the idea of the simple is already to be found contained in that of the complex and in the idea of analysis, and in such a way that we come to this idea quite apart from any examples of simple objects or of propositions which mention them. And we realize the existence of the simple object a priori as a logical necessity." The idea of the existence of ultimate atomic elements, individuals in this sense, is thus a fundamental assumption of logical analysis and an indispensable premise of the very method of analytic philosophy. Conversely, I believe that the idea that simple objects or propositions, sentences do not exist, but that everything depends on and therefore reflects a sort of a priori synthesis, which we could also call a sort of singularity, is, in my view, constitutive of philosophy and particularly idealism, which descends from Kant. I mentioned the idea of a priori synthesis by linking it to that of singularity. This transition might seem a bit abrupt, but with this, I intend to express a concept I consider constitutive of singularity. The fact that singularity implies an internal differentiation. The idea that difference is actually more primordial than identity. This is how Hegel expresses the Kantian notion of a priori synthesis. Kant's notion, I quote, of synthetic a priori judgments, the notion of something differentiated, which equally is inseparable of an identity which is in its own self, an inseparable difference, belongs to what is great and imperishable in his philosophy. It's a quotation from the Science of Logic. So that, okay, that singularity is related to difference is something that Hegel states in several places. For example, in Phenomenology, where he writes, singularity and universality are moments of self-consciousness, which means they are in the manner of abstractions of differences, which for consciousness are at the same time null. That is, they are not differences, but purely vanishing essences. In this regard, two clarifications are necessary. First one, when Hegel speaks of universality, particularity, and singularity as forms of the concept and judgment, these are not to be understood as objective determinations of the judgment, but I think as subjective determinations, in the sense that they express determinations of the subject. What is expressed in a singular judgment is not the finesse, so to say, of the object named, but rather the singularity of the operation that determines it as such. In Kantian terms, the forms of judgment are forms of the concept of the I, of the subject, which explains why the part of logic dealing with them is a subjective logic. And the second consideration is that consequently, in all these forms, the structure of the I, or rather of self-consciousness, is implied and reflected. This structure is that of infinity, which is the structure of life or of everything that becomes. The process of life consists in positing figures and negating them. That is a continuous production and division. This coexistence of production and division, to the point of making them coincide, is, in my opinion, one of Hegel's most significant contributions to the conceptualization of life. Life produces itself by dividing itself, which stands in sharp contrast with mathematical notion where multiplication and division are inverse operations. Production, moreover, is not to be understood as multiplication. Multiplication is a serial operation that can be reduced to addition. For instance, 2 times 3 equals 3 plus 3. While production involves powers, thus dynamics, and its inverse operations, which are the extractions of roots, which involve real numbers, and is therefore a truly transformative relation, in my opinion. Singularity is related to powers, not to multiplication, that is, to plurality. This distinction is crucial for differentiating it from individuality. It is also true, however, that when Hegel speaks of individuality, he speaks of it in different terms. I tried to clarify the normal concept of individuality as not divisible. But Hegel states that singularity is the principle of individuality and personality. But here, for him, individuality should be understood as a condition of the subject, is a concept of the personal, of personality, and thus as is a principle of freedom. And yet again, this concept, individuality, has to do with the infinite. So it's a different use of this concept, I want to stress. But what should we understand by infinite at this point? As is well known, Hegel discusses various forms of infinity: the qualitative infinity, the bad or spurious infinite, the serial infinity, and the true infinite. Here I will focus on the latter. In the remark 1 of the section titled The Infinity of the Quantum in the Science of Logic, Hegel deals with the mathematical infinite, which is in the differential calculus. And the very principle of this calculus is for Hegel the fact that the infinite is expressed as relation. This calculus deals with infinitesimal magnitudes that are no longer quanta, but that exist and are defined solely by their relations. For this reason, in this calculus, if they are considered in isolation, they can be overlooked. As Wolf writes, they are similar to a grain of sand that the wind carries away and therefore does not compromise the measurement of a mountain's height. Wolf expresses here the idea that the infinitesimal is an individuum, a sort of atom, a grain of sand. But Hegel considers this view as completely wrong. The infinitesimal, indeed, shows the nature of the true infinite. He says explicitly that in the mathematical infinite, we have the first appearance of the true infinite. It is no longer a quantum, and thus, at the very end, is not something that can be added or taken away. So if the infinite is relation, its first expression, says Hegel, is the fraction. For example, 2/7. In it, the quantum is not taken in its immediacy as 2 or 7, as an immediate finite number, but in mediated form, inasmuch 2 or 7 could be also replaced with 4 and 14, 6 and 21, etc. But the relation in this case does not change. In this vanishing of quantitative determinateness, compared to the permanence of the relation, in this indifference of the infinite number of finite quanta that can be substituted in the relation, and in the very persistence of the relation as such, Hegel finds again the true nature of the infinite. One can also express a fraction in serial form, writes Hegel, for example, in this case, 0.285714. The fact remains that the difference of these expressions, if one takes the serial form or the fraction, is for Hegel fundamental, because the relation is more originary than the series and expresses completely what the series can express only incompletely. This is a spurious infinite for Hegel, with an etc. that can never be given actually. He writes, this so-called finite expression, 2/7, is the truly infinite expression. The infinite series, on the other hand, is in truth a sum. Its purpose is to represent, in the form of a sum, what is in itself a ratio, and the existing terms of the series are not terms of a ratio, but of an aggregate of atoms, we could say. For this reason, one must not understand every relation as a possibly infinite series of entities, but on the contrary, every, so to say, so-called simple entity, every singularity, if we want to say, as relation. This, expressed in mathematical terms, is what Hegel means when he says that the finite is not without relation to the order. It exists only in this relation. It exists thanks to it and is dissolved without it. Nevertheless, Hegel writes, the representation of the infinite by a fractional number is still imperfect. Precisely because in the relation finite, determinate quanta are still given, and the relation they are linked in is something finite. This is only apparently overcome in the algebraic expression, where in the place of numbers we find the letters A and B, which however still do not represent anything but some generic quanta. The fraction A over B seems therefore to be a more suitable expression of the infinite, says Hegel, since A and B, taken out of their relation to each other, remain undeterminate, and taken separately to have no special peculiar value. It is instead in differential calculus that, according to Hegel, the quantum vanishes completely, because it no longer has any finite, determinate, and fixed consistency. In the relation dy dx, the magnitudes exist only as they are part of this relation, and outside of it, they are nothing. So Hegel writes clearly, but there is still another stage where the peculiar character of the mathematical infinite becomes prominent. In an equation in which x and y are determined primarily by a power relation, x and y are, as such, are still supposed to signify quanta. Now this significance is altogether and completely lost in the so-called infinitesimal differences. The x, the y are no longer quanta, nor are they supposed to signify quanta. It is solely in their relation to each other that they have any meaning, a meaning merely as moments. They are no longer something taken as a quantum, not finite differences, but neither are they nothing, not empty nullities. Apart from their relation, they are pure nullities, but they are intended to be taken only as moments of the relation, as determinations of the differential coefficient dy dx. So this is the true infinite for Hegel, which is nothing but this subsistence of the finite in and as relation to the other, and thus as its negation in a simple, finite, determinate quantum, which would be consistent in itself. For Hegel, its being infinite is its not being as an absolute atom, and the absolute, if one still wants to use this expression, is at the very end a negation, a sort of relation, a relational determination. This truth is expressed in a particularly effective way in this calculus, since here, for Hegel, we are no longer dealing with independent and atomic entities. The relation to the other is their only reason of being, both in the differential sense. Numerator and denominator are expressed as differences, and not in an immediate way like in the fraction, and also in the relational sense. These differences stand in a relation, that is, in a relation. We are dealing therefore only with relations of differences, which have no nature, order, a comparative and relational one. In such a way, the infinitesimal reveals the relational character of any determination, whether it is qualitative or quantitative. So there is an objection to this idea, a very simple objection, and that is that we are at the very end essentially dealing with quanta, even in the case of the differential relation, the y dx. Why, where there are no quanta, there will be in reality no relation at all. So that is, quanta are the conditions of every relation. They are first, and the relation is an addition to quanta, and there will be no relation without quanta. But to this objection, Hegel responds by inverting this argument. I quote, "But the truth is rather that that which has been solely in duration is not a quantum. The nature of quantum is such that it is supposed to have a completely indifferent existence apart from its ratio, and its difference from another quantum is supposed not to concern its own determination. On the other hand, the qualitative is what it is only in its distinction from an other. The said infinite magnitudes, therefore, are not merely comparable, but they exist only as a moment of comparison, i.e. of the ratio. So, to say that the magnitudes are only moments in the comparison means that they do not exist on their own. A quantum, I quote, has meaning only in its relation to its other. This conclusion deserves particular attention because here the physical and not merely mathematical significance of the Hegelian interpretation of this calculus emerges. If one does not grasp this aspect, this Hegelian concept of the infinite remains quite incomprehensible or is easily misunderstood. So in his explanation of differential calculus, Hegel refers to Newtonian theory, not to Leibnizian theory. For Newton, the infinitesimal magnitudes, the fluid, in the language of Newton, which is reminiscent of the medieval forma fluens, the generative principle of movement, that are expressed by differential relations, are not composed by indivisibles, namely by atoms. They are made rather of evanescent divisibles, that is to say, limits of relations of vanishing magnitudes. The last relation which expresses them is the one by which they pass away, vacuum evanescunt, and the first, the one by which they are born. The limit is precisely the initial and final moment of a generative process, and as such expresses the quintessence of becoming. Hegel's preference for Newton's way of understanding infinitesimals is thus clear in the Newtonian calculus of fluxions. The infinitesimal appear as a magnitude granted with an intimate dynamism, and not as a static magnitude, as a grain of sand. If the true infinite appears in mathematics, notoriously for Hegel the science of intellectual and static relations, it is because differential calculus does not signify quanta, but rather dynamism. Namely, it signifies infinitesimal differences that express physico-dynamic variations. So the infinite is nothing but the structure of becoming. At this point, we can say that every instant, as it represents a moment of change, is a singularity. Obviously, this applies at a very small scale, which does not convey the idea of singularity as a point where a major transformation occurs. However, in my opinion, this difference is only quantitative and not conceptual. The infinitesimals that Hegel conceives in this way are nothing but the singularities of every transformation, of everything. That is the ultimate determination of each reality, which, far from being a sort of atom, again a grain of sand, is instead a relation in which every quantum disappears, and what remains is a relation, an infinite relation, because it lacks finite determinations. Idealism, as Hegel writes, I quote, is the proposition that the finite is ideal. The idealism of philosophy consists only in this, not recognizing the finite as a true being. The fact that the finite does not exist means that every individual reality, every singularity, is in fact infinite. But for Hegel, there is another way to express the not quantitative nature of the infinite. And this is represented by those particular relations that are the real numbers. These magnitudes, Hegel writes, I quote, contain a higher kind of infinity than do those which can be summed, namely an incommensurability or the impossibility of representing the quantitative ratio contained in them as a quantum, even in the form of a fraction. So the real or incommensurable magnitudes cannot be expressed as a relation between quanta. However, this does not mean that in this case there is no relation at all, but rather that there is only and primarily a relation. These magnitudes are such only as relations, and their exemplarity consists in the fact that they reveal the general relational character of every magnitude, that is, of every quantum. So we can approach now the question of contingency. So why? Why? Because Leibniz compared the incommensurable magnitudes to the truth of fact, that is, to the truth of contingent he writes, I quote, the difference between a necessary truth and contingent truth is indeed the same as that between commensurable numbers and incommensurable numbers. In the same way, in fact, that the factorization can become a unity of shared measure in commensurable numbers, so too in necessary truth, the demonstration or reduction leads to identical truth. As with irrational numbers, the factorization proceeds to infinity, and indeed we arrive at a common unity of measure and obtain a series, however undetermined. In the same way and with the same process, contingent truths require an infinite analysis, which only God can conduct. So what is the question here? The question is that for Leibniz, every truth can be expressed as a relation of identity. He writes, the foundation of truth consists in the connection of the predicate with the subject. That is, in the predicate being included in the subject, or manifestly, as in an identical truth, or implicitly. On the contrary, so in this rational of necessary truth, this possibility of reduction to a common element, to a basic fraction, so to say, corresponds to a commensurability, because we find a ultimate matter, so to say, of this truth, while in the truth of fact, or contingent truth, we are faced with a sort of incommensurability, where we can proceed in infinitum, but this their knowledge is possible only for God. We can conduct this analysis just in the infinite. So, this structure of contingent truth seems to me another way to express singularity. Singularity eludes definition because it requires an infinity of determinations that can never be fully exhausted. But this is also the condition of contingency, as we saw, because contingency can never be analytically deduced like a sort of theorem from a system. That is in a necessary way, what recalls Krug's objection to Hegel, very well-known objection. So what I go to the conclusion, just 2 pages. What I have aimed to argue here is that the form of singularity for Hegel is that of the infinite, and a particular kind of infinite. The one that is expressed as a relation between 2 magnitudes that are not quanta, that is a non-rational relation, to use the proper mathematical terminology. In fact, singularity is something irrational, allogon, just like contingency. Singularities express something liminal that resides both within the system and at the same time outside of it. I quote again Alessandro here, who writes, the Hegelian treatment of the singular, a direct consequence of the modal and relational categories, develops this liminal aspect of the contingent, whereby it seems to simultaneously be part of the system and excluded from it. So, our last question, but we can ask at this point, but what is then rationality? So I think that what we said is the fact that the kind found in so-called rational numbers, the ratios between quanta, that is between individuals in the sense of atoms, which therefore allows analysis to reach a fixed point. This condition, which is required to contemporary analytic philosophy, is this what we have to understand as rationality, ratio, or something else? So in ancient mathematics, and still today, incommensurable magnitudes were called aloga, which means just irrational. But this designation was due to the fact that for the early Pythagoreans, reality was made up of whole numbers and ratios between whole numbers, i.e., in Hegel's terminology, quanta and fraction. So the world for the Pythagoreans is well represented by the screen of contemporary computers, which is a material representation of atomistic or digital philosophy. These screens are made by pixels, little points of light, and then it is impossible to draw a perfect diagonal of a square or a perfect circle, and they are therefore not be represented there. So, since incommensurable magnitudes, like just root of 2 or pi Greek, cannot be expressed through fraction, as also Hegel remarked, calling this a higher kind of infinity, they were therefore called aloga, irrational. However, Greek mathematicians later realized that it was possible to operate differently, i.e. to define not ratios on the basis of whole numbers, so take whole numbers as a starting point in order to define relations, but on the contrary, to define numbers in general on the basis of ratios. The result is that the ratio takes priority over the definition of quanta, exactly as we have seen what Hegel writes, and I quote, but the truth is rather that that which has been solely in the ratio is not a quantum. The nature of a quantum is such that it is supposed to have a completely indifferent existence apart from its ratio. The said infinite magnitudes, therefore, are not merely comparable, but they exist only as moments of comparison, i.e. of the ratio. So Hegel thus shows that he is truly aware of the conceptual revolution brought about by the discovery of incommensurable quantities in the ancient world, the result of which is that the so-called irrational numbers are actually logos and definable as logos, a logos alogos, we can say. They instead exist only in comparison, but in any way they express in some way a logos. In a totally unexpected way, by speaking of the discovery of these magnitudes, incommensurable magnitudes, in paragraph 231 of the Encyclopedia, Hegel writes, this is for me a very interesting quotation. Nevertheless, it is quite noteworthy that following this course, geometry ultimately hits upon incommensurabilities and irrationalities, where if it wants to go further in its determination, it is driven beyond the principle of mere understanding. As often happens elsewhere, so here too the terminology is inverted, such that what is named rational, the fraction, is something due to the understanding, but what is called irrational is much more a beginning and trace of what is in keeping with reason, Vernunft. So, contrary to his usual distrust of mathematics, which he accuses of being merely intellectual, Hegel here sees it as a positive way for reason to proceed. Instead of remaining fixed on the intellectual forms of natural numbers, reason is driven beyond them, beyond their limit. What in mathematics is called irrational is actually the true form of reason, since it expresses the real movement of reason and of reality. You can say also of consciousness, while what is called rational is in fact only its intellectual form. So incommensurable magnitudes, just like singularity, which is a heterogeneous infinite that cannot be reduced to any relation of identity, are not something irrational, but on the contrary, express the true way reason operates. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Nino, so much for your for this beautiful talk, and I mean also for the gracious way you mentioned my work. So thank you so much. There was so much to discuss, so this is really this was really great. Many um, insights, and also a great contribution to what was another streak in our seminar, which is so to say an attempt to interpret Hegel's work as a philosophy of singularity in a way, which is something that I and Gregory so worked upon. So it was really great to hear you. I'd say so. We can open the debate, and please, if there are questions, remark. As usual, if you are on Zoom, you can just make yourself visible. Otherwise, if you are on YouTube, you can write your question, and Gregory or I will read it out to the speaker. So it's open, please. Maybe while break the ice, I do have a few questions, and I have one in particular. I was wondering whether you agree with this. The problem of infinity and the problem of incommensurability, you said throughout your presentation that the basic idea, so to say, is to evade a very common representation, which is that the simple comes first, and so to say, a complex or difference comes after it. So this is maybe the great challenge of Hegel's philosophy, this counterintuitive idea that no, listen, it's not really that, and that's why, so to say, Hegel's philosophy is the opposite of every philosophy of the origin. So to say, there is no origin. The origin is already a result, something that comes after, so to say. I mean, the simple is only the simple retrospectively, so to say, as a result of something. And that's why I wanted to ask you whether you think that this is the case for difference, but also for mediation. So maybe a term that did not come up as much in your presentation, but maybe is the point, is mediation, is Vermittlung, namely the idea that mediation is not, so to say, an operation that comes after, that comes to mediate something immediate that is already there, but rather this strange, and again, a very odd idea that, so to say, mediation is the first. So mediation is what is the primum, so to say, and that the mediated or the immediate even is something that comes after it, which is maybe a reason why, and that's so I ask you this because it's really my current project, the reason why maybe Hegel could be accounted as the, so to say, the media philosopher par excellence, in a way, even though there hasn't been many attempts to read him in this way. So basically the question is whether you think that what you say about infinity and about simplicity and about difference can be all brought together with reference to the problem of Vermittlung.
Yes, of course, I agree completely, no, with this view in the sense that for Hegel, there is nothing which is at the origin as something which is without relation with something else. So this is, in my opinion, the idea of the so to say, sameness between being and nothing, in the sense that even negation is for Hegel a form of mediation. And so quality is just this relation to something else. And so when Hegel speaks about the true infinite, he says also that at this point, quality is restored. In the sense, in the passage from quality to quantity, now we find the idea that quantity is something which stands for itself, you know, 1, 2, 3, and so on. We can sum these elements, so to say atoms, so 1 plus 1 plus 1, and generate in this way the numbers. And the operations, no, are something which is added, so to say. The first operation is the addition, no, and it's a reality of the numbers. But this is the spurious infinite, we know. And Hegel, when he speaks about the differential calculus, stresses just this fact that the fact that we here have to do with differences and relation of differences. This is a restoration of quality, since quality is defined as the relation to something else. And so, of course, this is also a form of mediation, because every ratio, every relation is, in this sense, a mediation. But if I can add also something, you know that I am in my studies started from grammatical interest. So my first studies were about the distinction in categorams, which is an analog to this idea incommensurable magnitudes and commensurable magnitudes. Leibniz says this explicitly. Commensurable magnitudes are like categorams, and incommensurable magnitudes are like syncategorams. But the syncategorams are the connective in the language, no? And I study, you know, in my book about Hegel and Heidegger, of course. So I started with the idea that syncategorams are basic and not categorams. So the preposition, and of course I concentrated above all on the prepositions. No, because my interest was in existential analytic by Heidegger, which is made by syncategorams, prepositions by, zu, and so on. This is the structure of the word, and the role of the instrument, of the tool in this description is very important. So for me, there is this relation between syncategorams, tools, instrument, if you want, media, no, and incommensurable magnitudes at mathematical level, since this quantity are also a sort of Vermittlung, because I cannot go now deeper in this idea, but the solution of the Zenonian paradox about the movement is just the idea that the movement is a continuum, and this continuum is important to theorize the real numbers. And I add this in order to explain, you know, this, but for the other present there. So the fact that Titus called this magnitudes dynamis. And so this is just the fact that these magnitudes are what allows the transformation in reality. And so I think that the introduction of a modal distinction in ancient philosophy in Plato, or at a certain point defines being as dunamis, the sophist, and above all in Aristotle, is due to the confrontation with this mathematical problem, which is very important, I mean, for Plato. So the dialogue Titus is devoted to the mathematician who theorized these magnitudes, developed the doctrine about this magnitude, which was taken also by Euclid in the book 10 of the Elementa. So of course, for me, this is a good idea, Hegel as a philosopher of mediation and of media.
Well, thank you. By the way, I'm very fond of your book on Hegel and Heidegger because I mean it's a personal story. But when I tried my PhD in Turin, after the test, after the interview for the doctorate, I went into a bookshop and I found that book. It's the first book I ever bought in Turin. So it's
Okay.
I remember it's quite
So,
fondly as I mean the start, the beginning of my relationship with Turin, so to say.
okay.
And well, I believe Greg has a question, so please, Greg.
Thank you so much for the talk, Gaetano. I don't read Italian. Sadly, I only read German and Greek, so but I can pick up the book that has been translated. So I think I will do that after hearing this talk. Ontology of the uncommensurable.
Dunamis, yes, the title is Dunamis, Ontology of the Uncommensurable, yes.
Okay, very good, very good. I think I'll find a lot of stimulation in this. You've kept me awake. I was very sleepy coming in, but you woke me up when you went into the calculus. I have so many questions, but let me start with a couple questions. The first one about mathematical concepts in general and the relation to singularity. And then the second question is about the notion of relation. And in particular, I want to ask about self-relation. And then I will, finish with a few remarks. So my first question is about the place of self-reference in this account of singularity and infinity that you gave. Because it seems that one of the features of singularity, Einzelheit, in Hegel, is that singularity itself is singular. Especially if you look at the logic of the concept, this is how singularity operates. Singularity is a universal concept, but it's also an instance of itself. It's a member of itself. And generally, Hegelian categories have this structure. Being is like this, concept is like this. But then there seems to be concepts like the successor function, which, for example, isn't part of the series that it generates, right? So it's not like first, second, successor function, fourth. And so generally one might be skeptical as, that somehow the concept of singularity can be captured by any kind of mathematical notion that seems to lack this feature of self-reference. And for that reason, of course, will always be incomplete, exactly because it leaves itself out of the account. And so you'll have incompleteness and all of this as well, just on the side of this lack of self-reference, which doesn't seem to be the case for singularity, which contains itself within itself. And I'm wanting to connect that with self-relation. And the notion of relation was very important. I thought it was very fascinating how you showed how the infinitesimal involves the overcoming of finitude. That was very nice. And idealism and the sense of singularity there. I thought that was very nice. But I also wonder about self-relation in general here, because one way Hegel describes these categories of the logic is that they are definitions of the absolute. And you think about what the absolute is, it's not relative. It's in fact what transcends the relative. And you might think that would mean not in relation to another. This is very basically. And exactly what we have here with these infinitesimal is that they are, in fact, nothing independent of the relation. This is overcoming a finitude, but in another way, it seems to be exactly that which is not absolute. Of course, self-relation makes good sense with an absolute notion, because not in relation to another, it would be in relation to itself. So if you have an absolute concept, it is going to be in relation to itself. If it's in a relation at all, it seems that it would be in self-relation. So I also wonder about this, if does self-relation play any role for you in thinking about singularity, the absolutely infinite or the true infinite, especially in this link to the idea of the absolute, which every definition of the logic somehow is supposed to be? Yeah, so maybe I start with those questions. Yeah, so thank you. I hope those made sense. Those questions made sense.
So thank you very much for this question, which is not so easy,
Of course not, but it's
to answer. So,
yes.
Starting from the question of the absolute, there is a paragraph, in the part devoted to the modal concepts, in the science of logic, which is titled the absolute. And it is not by chance that in this chapter, Hegel deals also with Spinoza and Leibniz. Now, because I think this represent two different ways of conceiving of the absolute, which does not take into account just the relation, even in the form of self-relation, which is the consciousness. So on one side, we have Spinoza, for which the absolute is a big individuum, so to say, something which is a sort of one, of a unity in itself, and the relation inside are something which is added to his fundamental reality. This is the concept of substance as identity, only identity. And on the other side, we have Leibniz, who conceives the ultimate reality as monads, that is, as individua. There is a very interesting paragraphs in Alessandro's book. I quote again because I read so in the past weeks his book with many. So I take a lot. I learned also a lot from his book. So Leibniz, who thinks this absolute as monad without windows, without door, as says Leibniz explicitly. So without relation to the other. And so absolute means. So the strange thing is the fact that absolute means detached from every other thing, and so without relation. So this is the paradox at the very end. But for Hegel, the absolute has a relational structure, and even at the very end, in the form of a self relation to itself, and that is in the form of consciousness at the very end. But Hegel, everywhere, when he thinks about something which pretends to be only positive in itself, for instance, the concept of identity in the doctrine of the essence, even in this case, he says, in this case, there is a nullity, something which is nothing which is said in the identical formula, A equal A, there is a null, a nothing, which is said when I say A equal A. So,
I like this.
of course, this is a form of thinking which has to be understood in his sense and his meaning, because the idea is the fact that we cannot never separate something positive from is, I would say, pre-positive. I mentioned the preposition before, no, from his pre-positive condition, which is also another way to say that we cannot never separate the structure of reality from the knowing of reality. Since to say that when I say A equal A, there is a nothing which is said at the same time, is to say that there is a knowing, a form of consciousness, no, in every logical sentence, logical or every discourse at the very end. So I don't know if I answered also to your first question about Einzelheit. So of course we have not to understand Einzelheit in the sense of Einzelzimmer, in the sense of something which is a one. No, Einzelheit for Hegel, which we translate with singularity, but in German there is a specific word, Singularität, no, in order to name what I wanted to say also from the Oxford definition of singularity. But Einzelheit, no, is for Hegel also at the very end how it uses this concept in the logic begriffs logic, reflects always the operation of the I, as I say. It is not a property of something, of a quantum, so to say, but is at first sight an operation of the I that considers that thing in the world as a one. But this is another fact, and I think that it is a radical misunderstanding if we understand the concepts of the subjective logic as referring solely to characteristics of the judgment. They are characteristic of the judgment because they are form of synthesis, that is operations of the I in a very Kantian sense, because what Kant calls category are not, as for Aristotle, properties of the things, but operations of the I, of the I think.
Okay, yeah, so that's helpful. Especially your answer to the relation question was helpful. But maybe in answering the question about singularity, you've raised another one that I'd like to natural bridge to what I wanted to ask. And so maybe two questions again. The first one is about the subjective logic. There you were speaking about structure of self-consciousness or the I. But I wonder whether the logic of, say, universal, particular, singular, this, of course, I separate from judgment because judgment comes after. This Urteil comes after this. But if you just stay at the beginning, or even if you keep going, the question is are the logical structures elucidated there speaking directly about self-consciousness per se, or just logical structures that make self-consciousness possible, right? Because you can think about what?
Sorry, Greg, may I weigh in on this? Because there was a slide in the presentation that maybe expressed this very well, where there was a slide of judgment.
Maybe I missed it. Just to get
it was
on it?
No, you didn't miss it. I mean, it illustrates the problem. And so
yes.
I believe Gaetano said something like, Of course, the structure of the judgment is not about the judgment, but it is about the subject. And
Yes,
I believe
Yeah.
the question is about how to separate between these two elements. So what it means that it is not about the judgment, but it is about the subject. Because of course, there is I mean, you could understand that in what I consider to be the wrong way, but Gaetano, please correct me. The subject is not the consciousness, is not the subject in the meaning of, I don't know, the individual mind expressing an opinion or thinking, so to say. It's not
yeah.
about individual thought. So maybe, I mean, when
Okay.
I read that slide, I had the same problem you are having.
Okay, I
Yeah,
see. Yeah,
are
that.
determinations of a thought. So the subjective logic is a continuation of Wesen's logic, of course, no? In sense, but this is the ancient metaphysics for Hegel, the objective logic, and the new metaphysics inaugurated by Kant is what it takes into account in subjective logic, in my opinion.
I see. Okay, because my thought is that there's a lot of debate about what subjective means, but another way, and this may or may not be work with your reading, is the concept is subjective in the sense that the concept is the agency. The concept as such is self-particularizing, self-singularizing. It is the agency. In the lectures on philosophy of religion, he'll identify it as God when he's speaking in those terms, of course, because it's the religion lectures, so he'll identify these. And then, of course, when you have the transition from the syllogism to mechanism, you have the ontological argument shows up, and he says this transition is what we call the ontological argument. So you can also look at this subjectivity as self-particularizing, and there's nothing like that in Kant exactly. There's synthetic unity of apperception, but as Hegel says, Kant was overwhelmed by the sensuous manifold and really didn't think it through, right? Even though he had the idea, he didn't think it through. So that's I guess also my question about the subjective logic is, you can read the subjective logic meaning that really the concept is the agency. It's a self-particularizing agency. That was related to my question about self-reference, that, the concept of singularity is itself singular, or the concept of being is itself a being. It particularizes itself, which seems to be different from the way mathematical concepts operate.
Yes. So I think that we must understand the nature of subjective logic, also in the light of a remark that Hegel makes in the Phenomenology, when he speaks about the categories of Kant, and he says that it is a real insult. Insult in English, yes. Insult to knowledge to say that the categories are 12. No, as Kant did, because there is only one category. No, this is only one category, and this is the I think. No, the other categories are specifications, we can say, but are all operations, no, activities, in your word, if you want, of this unique category, which is the I. So in this sense, I think that in subjective logic, we speak of Entwicklung,
Yes,
deployment, because this is the place where we make clear, in a certain sense, for Hegel, the fact that all the logical procedures, all the different categories, forms of concepts, of judgments, and of reasoning in syllogism are all forms, no, operations, we can say, of the I, and this is the concept. In this sense, this is a subjective logic. So, but of course, the I never studied in a deep way the subjective logic. I studied better the doctrine of being, some parts of the doctrine of essence. I made my doctorate on the science of logic, but really this is the more difficult part of Hegel's system. And so Alessandro studied this better than me, as I saw in your book. But anyway, if you want, we can make also a seminar about the subjective logic. Sometime, I don't know. But so I don't have a very deep knowledge of this part anyway. So I studied better the last part, no, from the objectivity and so on, mechanism, chemism, and the teleology. So I was interested in this part. But anyway, I don't know if my answer was useful in some way.
Wayne, Greg, just connected to your questions, and before you ask maybe another question, I just wanted to comment on this. By the way, Gaetano, thank you really much, because I mean your insights on the problem of infinity in the logic of being are absolutely crucial, and maybe a big problem is how to connect them to subjective logic. So that is maybe very interesting, but it's also a question that is very internal to Hegel. So maybe there is a more general question. It is a way how I understood this issue of the subjectivity of judgment. I don't know whether this can help or not, but I always had a problem with Kant's. There is a place in Die Logik, in Kant's lectures on logic, where there is a strange loop. Basically, Kant says judgments, of course, are all universal, and you can only the concepts are all universal, so you can only distinguish concepts as singular, particular, or universal, depending on the judgment they are in. But then when he analyzes the judgment, he says the quantity of the judgment depends on the notion that as the place of the subject. So it is a strange loop, so to say. And in a way, I always interpreted the part of judgment in the subjective logic in a way as a way of saying, listen, the difference between, I don't know, a singular judgment, a universal judgment, a hypothetical judgment, a disjunctive judgment, a value judgment, etc., is not in the predicate or in the nature of the object, but it is in the meaning of the verb to be. So in the so to say, in the structure of the connection, which is, in my opinion, so one possible strong argument against a univocal reading of Hegel's ontology, namely the idea that, I mean, to me, the structure, so the section on judgment is really a section that can be read in order to say, listen, there are many different senses of being, and in order to show you that, see how many kinds of judgments there are. And these do not depend on the kind of object you are discussing. It depends on the way subject and predicate are connected to each other. So this be, this verb, this copula means a different thing in each kind of judgment. And maybe that's a way of saying, so maybe when you say it is not objective, but it is subjective, maybe the meaning could also simply be that. So it could be, you don't have to look at the kind of object you're talking about. You have to look at the way how you are connected, you are connecting subject and predicate. So you have to look at the structure of judgment, basically. And this structure is not univocal. That's maybe one way to put it. I don't know whether you, Gaetano, and also you, Greg, agree, so to say.
Yes, I agree. I wrote a book about the theories of judgment, and there is a chapter about the first one about Aristotle, Kant, Hegel, and so on. And so what you said is correct in the sense that it is the real meaning of the structure of the judgment conceived by Kant, because the very representative of the I think in the judgment is the copula, is not the logical subject, which is the representative of the object in the world. If I say the sky is blue, for instance, the sky is the subject in the judgment and is the representative of the object in the world. But the real representative of the I think, says Kant explicitly in the paragraph 16, 19 of the critique, is the copula. So in the sense, the different ways of connecting the subject and the predicate in the judgment are different way of the operations of the I think. No, and this is what is important. Of course, Hegel makes a critique in Glauben und Wissen to this idea, in the sense that the copula is something which refers to something inconscious, which is not completely expressed, but also because for Kant, the I think is a mere function, no? A mere synthesis operation, a mere synthesis, and though it is represented by the copula. And Hegel says, but the judgment has to become a syllogism, because in the syllogism, the real mediation is made by the predicate, which becomes subject in the second premise, no? So to say, no? A is B, the subject of the first is the predicate in the second one, no? C is A, and so on. Now, in this case, for Hegel, is like the real mediation, no? Is acquires also a substantial constitution. Is not only a form of synthesis like the copula, but acquires also a substantial, which is the general critique that Hegel gives against the I think for Kant at a concept at the theoretical level and at the moral level, which is without content, he says, no? And so we have to give a sort of substance, which is the ethicity, no, the Sittlichkeit at a moral level, and we have to express, no, to unfold in a certain sense also the content of the I think, and this happens in the syllogism for Hegel. So I agree with
Yeah, Alex, maybe I'll just also say something and then answer your question, and then also ask my final question. My final
okay.
You are speaker. Because I just must ask it. And we have time. I think there's a YouTube question, but it's a bit it's a bit off topic, but maybe we'll ask it anyway because yeah, they took the time to write it. No, I'm very sympathetic, Alex, to what you said, and I also like Gaetano also. But I suppose maybe I would maybe also express myself maybe a little differently. I also think about different kinds of judgment as involving different, not only ways of being, but also different forms of universality, different structures of combination and synthesis. So you have like abstractions, classes, genera, and all of these are particularizations of a self-differentiating totality. So yeah, clearly the univocal view is not right, and the question is just how to work out the non-univocal aspects of the logic, and not just the judgment, but also the other sections. I wanted to ask, just to bring us to my last question about the contingency and the incommensurability. I wanted to ask you whether you think that Hegel's concept of singularity is also equally, or at least the concept of true infinity, which seems to be singular in his sense, also involves completeness and necessity. And I wonder whether, though, you want to emphasize or privilege the contingent and incompleteness, or whether you think it's equally important to assert completeness and necessity. And I think I'm probably more obsessed with completeness, I suppose. I have the sense that in the 20th century, we've tended to, and now into the 21st, because it's 2024, where we tend to fetishize incompleteness and difference and all of this. And it's a one-sidedness that I hope the 21st century will correct. Probably not, but a kid can dream. Now, let me say why I want to ask this question, because like if you go back to the true infinite, right, to the logic of being, so leave logic of concept behind. You look at logic of being before the quantum, right, where we just work out finitude and then infinitude, right? And then we have the bad infinite, and then the affirmative infinite. So with the true infinite or the affirmative infinite, we have the infinite that's finite and the finite that's infinite. And you see that, in fact, both have the same contradiction, that when you go back and forth from one to the other, you're just repeating the same universal content. It's the infinite that's finite, the finite that's infinite. And so you're not moving actually from one to the other. You're moving from the infinite to the infinite. And it's the same contradiction. I would see the notion of the affirmative infinite as it's complete, it's self-contradictory, it's a self-contradictory completeness, and that's in fact necessary and unavoidable. There is contingency and there is incompleteness in it, because there's no end to going around the circle of the true infinite, right? There is a kind of and the true infinite is found in the never in the, what I could say, repetition of the same, in the infinite never-ending roundabout. So acknowledging the incompleteness and the contingency, I tend to also want to say, well, yes, but there's the completeness and necessity found in this. And so what we're dealing with here with true infinity really is a self-contradiction. So do you think it's one-sided to just emphasize the contingency and incommensurability, or do you think that they really do have a privileged place? And what do you do with completeness and necessity in your thinking about this matter?
Okay, this is a very, very difficult question. So I wrote a paper about the idea that, which is not only my idea, that Kant system, is an anticipation of Gödel's theorem, in the sense that Kant tries to avoid contradiction, and his system is therefore incomplete. The thing itself, is the place of this incompleteness, because if we want to reach the totality of the metaphysics, we fall in contradiction, antinomies, and so on. Instead, Hegel's system tries to give us a sort of complete description, so to say, of reality, and therefore it is contradictory, So I think that this is true in some way, but at the very end, we have also to understand what Hegel conceives, what Hegel conceives of with the word completeness.
Yes.
Completeness. So when I say, for instance, that identity, says also nothing. So, and in this sense, contradiction at the very end, he says, is the development of this original contradiction, which is already in the identity. But in which sense identity is contradictory? Because if we want to be complete, to completely grasp identity, we have to take into account what is said, what is positive, and what is not said. The nullity, which is said, says Hegel, the nothing, which is said at the same time. And so I think that this is the way also to understand the relation between necessity and contingency, because necessity in some way takes into consideration only what is already realized in reality. So the positive possibility which are realized, and in this sense, what is realized couldn't be different of this, because just these possibilities gave rise to that phenomenon, to that event. And this is the way of conceptualizing necessity. I take into account only the positive possibilities. But if I take into account also the possibilities which are not realized, they are in certain sense also conditions of possibility of what is of reality, because in their non-realization, they are a sort of condition of what is realized. But they could realize. And in this sense, everything which I take into account the complete form of reality as something which is a consequence, so to say, of positive possibilities and negative possibilities, we realize that everything is contingent, because it is the result of something which could be different of what it was. There was a possibility, another possibility, and so at the liminal, so to recall what I said about the limit, at the liminal level of the realization, there was this ambiguity, this alternative, which makes just at this point contingent every event. And so in this sense, really, Hegel is the philosopher of the contingency in this sense, because everything is contingent at the very end. If we take into account just the completeness of reality, and so the idea to so to say to link this form of contingency with incommensurable magnitudes is in the fact that in order to make this, we have really to take into account all the possibility in the history. And this is an operation that is like the non-periodical part of every real number, which is not periodical, and which is this means that every number, decimal number, is not determined completely from the previous one. No, we do not know what is the n cipher of a real number. So this is the reason for which also Leibniz connected the contingent truth, historical truth to the incommensurable numbers.
Yeah, thanks so much. I mean, we could keep going. And then like the natural question following is everything is contingent. Is that necessary or contingent? And it will never end. But I'm going to stop myself. Thank you so much. But
Yeah, necessary contingent, necessary contingent. But so the play is just that, to reflect every category into itself. But this is the way Hegel proceeds against Kant, because Kant says that if we reflect the categories on themselves, I produce the dialectic of
exactly.
But Hegel makes this everywhere. The identity is identical to itself. But this is an operation we have to discuss about that and this is very easy to do with the modal categories, of course.
Yes.
And this produces everything.
There's a question on YouTube, but you can decide if you want to answer it or not, but let me read it, okay? And just so we have the opportunity and before we go here. The question is, I would like to ask outside the topic of the episode, if Hegel were among us now, what do you expect his opinions to be regarding the accelerating events taking place in the world?
I don't know.
Okay.
I can speak about the science of logic, but about the events which are happening in the world, this is beyond my possibility. So
I think it's pretty good if you can speak to the eternal events happening in logic, though, or the atemporal development, the infinitesimal, and the overcoming finitude in the infinitesimal.
Okay.
I'm gonna pocket that as inspiration for the evening. Alex, do you have any final comments before we?
Yes, I have maybe a final question, which is basically a way to let Gaetano take the final word, if it's okay for you, Greg. I don't know.
Yes.
Well,
yes, please.
not that if you want to add something, of course, it's
My
your
final
word.
word would be ciao.
No, but so final words. Let's be plural. No, Gaetano, it's really a way of also evoking something that has been going on throughout the seminar. So we have many souls, so to say. There has been some Hegelians, some Hegel scholars. There has been some monists, as I already playfully reminded, and there has also been some representative of what I've been calling contemporary French thought, that maybe is, so to say, the tradition in which the word singularity has been used in the most prominent way. So when we think about the singularity in the debate, it is often connected to I don't know, Gilles Deleuze, for instance. And I wanted to ask you something, since you are I mean, not only a great Hegel scholar, but also a great Derrida scholar. And also, if I'm not wrong, you studied with Derrida, actually. So, I mean,
Yes. My first study was about Derrida, about the concept of technique by Derrida.
Absolutely. So, I wanted to ask you about basically this. So, do you believe that the way how the notion of singularity has been used in the contemporary French thought, which is very often a way of criticizing Hegel, so a way of expressing an anti-Platonic or an anti-Hegelian stance, is incompatible with what you just showed us. So, in a way, do you think that ultimately there is an incompatibility between, so to say, the notion of singularity in Hegel's philosophy and the notion of singularity in, I don't know, Deleuze in particular, but also, I mean, the notion of difference, for instance, in Jacques Derrida's philosophy. So I was wondering whether you have an opinion, at very least, on the relationship between these two words, so to say.
So my opinion is just an opinion which is not completely grounded in a deep knowledge of, for instance, Deleuze. I read something of Deleuze, for instance, difference and repetition, where he speaks also about the differential calculus, and I find that very, very interesting. I don't know whether some other books of Deleuze, for instance, Anti-Oedipus and Mille Plateau, no, are in the same line of difference and repetition. I find that there is a sort of so because in Deleuze, I think, no, this is just an opinion, but I would know better, and maybe some Deleuzian could be say that it is not true. But I have the impression that there is at the very end a sort of atomism also in Deleuze, in the sense I explained, because he makes reference to Lucretius, for instance. There is this very interesting essay also in the Logic of Sense. I don't remember where it is published. And so I think, and he speaks always about aggregate, for instance, and so on. And this formula, aggregation, seems something which a sort of composition of atomic elements. So for me, at least, it's clear that Hegel is not an atomist. No, and this is for me very, very interesting. So Enzo Melandri, in his book La linea e il circolo, says explicitly that the discovery of the incommensurable magnitudes is a definitive objection against every atomism, no, because it leads to the formulation of the point as something which is not a part, no, meros, which is the word that in Greek means fraction, no, it's not a part of something and has no dimension. And so this is my idea, but of course, this is my impression when I am reading some writing of Deleuze at the end. Even the concept of multitude, for instance, I say that there is a difference, in my opinion, between multiplication as 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1 and a production. Production is something different, in my opinion. So anyway, I don't want to say my last words with something completely wrong, please. So take all this in a very caritative way.
No, absolutely. And Greg, do you have anything to add?
No, just thank you. You have our gratitude, Gaetano, for your very stimulating talk, and I think so it was a wonderful way to end the series. Or at least the first term will have over 13, I think, people giving talks on a variety of subjects, from ineffability, singularity and ineffability, to more ancient philosophy, some more Duns Scotus, and Spinoza, some more contemporary work. So I think we're going to be filling in gaps and continuing the good work. So Alex and I will be giving talks finally. So we'll have to do some work and not just comment and critique everybody else's papers. So we actually have to get on the hot seat, produce something. So
we will assist working. Yeah, as well. Absolutely. Many thanks, Gaetano. Many thanks to all of you. Greg, first of all, for doing this with me, and Francesco for being here also. So almost every time. And to all of you watching on YouTube and Zoom. And we'll keep you posted very soon with the next seminar cycle and with the collective volume. For now, Gaetano, again, thanks for your generosity, for your insights. And
thank
have
you
a good time.
Thank you to you, to Antonio, Francesco, Kadir, and Alessandro, and Greg. And I have to say my last word. Ciao.
Ciao, ciao. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.